Hello and welcome everyone who's still in the room or who has just joined in. We're continuing with our next presentation today at Adobe DITA World 2016, going global with your DITA content made easy. And there's one company who can make that really easy, and that's SDL. And today I have the product manager from SDL Trader Studio here in the room, and that's Daniel Brockmann.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. Yeah, really great for me to be able to do this presentation today at DITA World. So thanks a lot for the invitation. I will dive right in and share my screen. So this will be a mix of slides and live demo of software. I always like to make things very tangible because translation is still a concept that often people wonder about, and how does everything work, and where's the technology going, what is actually on offer. So I would like to use today's opportunity also to just give an introduction to our solutions in that area, but then also really make it tangible by actually round-tripping a DITA document from FrameMaker 2015 into our translation productivity environment, SDL Trader Studio, then do a bit of translation, a bit of review, show you a bit the options that are available, and then go back to FrameMaker at the end with a translated file. So just that you get really a concrete example of how this works. So just a few words around the agenda then. First of all, who are we actually? So SDL often as a name is not so well known, but some of our brands are very well known. Among them, obviously, then also SDL Trader's Studio. The Trader's brand is very strong in the market for translation productivity. So next I would then like to give you a quick introduction to our translation productivity suite, just in theory. Again, many of you might not actually know how translation productivity works. I always like to compare what we have on offer to a kind of Microsoft Office in a way. So Microsoft Office is the suite for productivity in terms of word processing and spreadsheets and so on. And our productivity suite is pretty much the equivalent in the translation space. So professional translators work with SDL Traders in the same way as a Microsoft Word user uses Word to produce a document. So that's maybe a comparison that can help explain how we position ourselves. Then obviously we have very rich support for lots and lots of file types. One of the key differentiating factors, or of the key factors of any translation productivity tool, is that you need to be able to support a vast amount of different file types coming in, and then also being able to round trip them to the languages that are supported, which in our case is kind of virtually every language on the planet. What is very interesting though is any kind of standardization is interesting. So although file types are really, I would say, a bit sloppily all over the place, it's very good to see standardizations. For example, DITA is a very interesting XML-based standardization where we can actually make sure in our product as well that we support the fine details that we can support because we know the format in advance. So that's nothing new for us. And so I would like to show you also how this works in the bit deeper details, and so that you are aware of the rich support of this format in our translation productivity environment. And then, yes, as I mentioned, the product demonstration. So Stefan already introduced me at the beginning, but maybe a brief word on my role as well within SDL. So I'm the product management director for our translation productivity product. So we have got a product management team, and I'm leading that up, and I'm specifically responsible for the environment that we will see today. But we also have some other auxiliary products and a rich suite of other applications in our portfolio, and we will take a look at that as we go through the presentation. So if we briefly take a look at SDL as the company that I'm working for, so we are leaders in providing both global content management, so rich content management tools portfolio, and then also language solutions. And when we talk about language solutions, we really refer to both a portfolio of services, so we do translation ourselves, but then, and this is where I'm working, a rich portfolio of technology pieces that we are selling as part of our language technology solutions. So we have been founded in 1992. We are traded at the London Stock Exchange. We've got lots of offices around the world for translation services, but also technology. Adobe is one of our many partners that we have. Thousands of employees, very many enterprise deployments of our translation management tools and our translation productivity tools. So we are very, and I'm personally quite proud of the long history also that we have around providing solutions to the market in terms of language technology. Yeah, and this really means at the end of the day that we are powering 79 out of the top 100 global brands with our technology. It might be content management, it might be translation management, but we are helping all the global brands or a vast majority of the global brands with our technology. So if we take a look briefly at some logos, we are very, again, we are very proud of being really stretching from all the extremes in the market in terms of organizations and verticals. So we go right all the way from supporting the EU, for example, with thousands of studio licenses that we have sold there. So we are very present in the government space, but then at the other extreme, if you like, we are also powering the likes of SAP or Volkswagen or even the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So we have really a very rich portfolio of customers, partly based on our rich history, but also part of the relevance that I think we provide in terms of providing translation productivity. So if we take a step back a little bit and look at why we are doing what we're doing, if we take a look at the entire kind of purchasing cycle of customers, there is a pre-purchase phase, there is a post-purchase phase, and language plays a key role in all these different phases. So as you can see here, there are a few sound bites and numbers that I present here. No need to read them all out to you, but you can see that customers try to avoid English, although it's an omnipresent language, but they really need content in their native language when they want to buy something, when they want to research something, and then afterwards when they want to get support. In the knowledge base, for example, it's very interesting to look at automated machine translation for knowledge bases, for example, where we can also help. So we really try to look at the entire customer experience cycle when it comes to supporting them in terms of language, that they have the best possible experience because they see everything in their own language. And if we take a look at how content has actually exploded over the last decades, it's really, this really makes up a very big challenge in terms of language as well, because if source language content explodes, it means that there is lots more volume that needs to be translated all of the time. And actually, even if you take every single translator on the planet, they can only translate so much in terms of the content that's out there. So it's really important to think about solutions that make translators and the whole translation supply chain as effective as possible. So if we take a look at, again, some numbers, and every minute we see 100,000 tweets, 571 websites are created. Let's just imagine that a few of them need to be localized and translated. This already creates a challenge in itself. Blogs are published on WordPress. Lots and lots of content, pieces of content are put on Facebook, and so on and so forth. So this means at the end of the day, well, I don't even know how to pronounce that number in English, quintillion probably. Bytes are created every single day, and who can handle this all when it comes to managing translation? Obviously, we are not saying we can do this, but we can help make especially professional translators more productive when it comes to translating content, as well as helping our enterprise customers manage the translation flow. I think both of these aspects are very key. You need a best-of-breed translation management in terms of the work giver side, and you need best-of-breed translation productivity solutions for the work doer side. And I always like to talk about this work giver, work doer relationship that we try to support as best as possible. So if we take a look then briefly at the work doer side with translation productivity, I would like to give you a little bit of an introduction to our technology that we have to offer here. And again, it's clearly the market leader. So if we say market leader, what does it actually mean? 80% of the translation supply chain has touched SDL Charter Studio at some point. So it's really, like I said, like the Microsoft Office for professional translation in terms of the market dominance. We have been here for a long time. Actually, we had two generations of products in the 90s and beginning of the 2000s. We had the predecessor to the current solution, which was called SDL or Trados Translators Workbench. So the original brand was Trados. And then we reinvented ourselves in 2009 with our Studio 2009 product, which then has seen actually 5 versions since then. So if you take a close look at the left-hand side, those of you that have eagle eyes, you will probably see that we just have 4 logos there, but we actually are about to release our 5th generation of Studio, which we call Studio 2017. And so this is why I'm referring here to 5 versions that are used by over 225,000 professionals worldwide. So that's a very large number when you take a look at the entire number of translation professionals worldwide, which is maybe around 500,000, 600,000. Yeah, and so this really means, because of this also quite fragmented supply chain, we need to make sure that we are very flexible in terms of the products that we offer. So we need to make sure that we have the tools that are needed so that you can rise to the challenge of ever-increasing demands on translation. So if we then take a look at the famous translation supply chain, this is it in a nutshell. So we are helping corporations and enterprises who are the work giver side. They require translation management, and they require also owning the resources that are created during translation. So we are referring to translation memories here. I will explain in a minute what this is. But this is typically owned by the work giver side, because the work giver side centralizes translation management and then farms out the work to the second big part of the supply chain, which are translation agencies or language service providers, short-term LSPs. So these LSPs receive the work from the enterprises and corporations, and they then actually pass on the work. So they project manage the work, because it's typically can mean, like if you take a look at Microsoft and they have a new Windows version, then this means, for example, 5,000 help files. So 5,000 help files need to be translated into many, many languages. And Microsoft typically says, well, I'm not doing that myself. I'm sourcing this out to LSPs. And those LSPs then work with the freelance translators to actually then make sure that the translation content is translated as efficiently as possible. And again, the LSPs also require SDL Trados files in the widest sense. And again, I will show you later what that actually means in practice. And then at the end of the day, hundreds of thousands of freelance translation professionals who then receive the work, sometimes directly from corporates, sometimes through the intermediary in terms of the LSPs. And they obviously are the users of SDL Trados Studio in terms of doing actual work, translating content. Whereas the LSPs also work with Studio to actually project manage the product, or they might use also other products in our portfolio that enhance the collaboration of translation teams. So one big topic obviously is, if you have a big project, you want to farm it out to several translators for the same language at the same time. So there you then need sharing, and you need to make sure that people can share resources. And that's also a key focus area for us. So if we take a look at our language platform that is equipped with a rich set of APIs, so that folks like Adobe can connect to it, or any other content source can connect. But then what we focus on in today's presentation is definitely the translation productivity side. And here we have Studio, but we also have GroupShare, which is our collaboration platform, which basically helps translation teams collaborate in real time. And we have a software localization platform called Pasolo as well, which is a dedicated environment for software localization. And again, if we take the Microsoft analogy, you could say that Trados Studio is the Microsoft Word, and Pasolo is the Microsoft Excel, if you like. So a very dedicated tool for a specific purpose. You can create tables in Word, and you can also localize some software with Studio. But it's best to have a dedicated worksheet application like Excel for doing the real worksheet work and table work. And this is where Pasolo comes in. It's like a dedicated solution for sometimes very heavyweight software localization of applications. So that's the translation productivity focus today. A very key piece of translation productivity is actually terminology management. I found it quite interesting, the few minutes that I caught of the previous webinar, where the presenter also talked about taxonomy and terminology and so on. And we have a very interesting product for this, which we call Multiterm, which stands for Multilingual Terminology Management. So this is actually kind of a knowledge base where you can create taxonomies both in source and target languages, which is then very key for a consistent and high quality translation process. And if we step back once again and look at the work giver and work doer side, so we are looking at the work doer side today, as I mentioned, but we do have very rich, very powerful, very flexible translation management solutions for the enterprise and for the corporate work giver. And we also have connections to automated translation, so machine translation. Language Cloud is to be mentioned here. So we've got a cloud-based machine translation platform, which actually is one of the very few machine translation platforms that exist on the planet that have that can actually be in the kind of same league as Microsoft Bing Translator and Google Translate. So we have our own dedicated machine translation platform that kind of is in the same space. And we will also briefly talk about that as when we see the demo. So with that out of the way, then really let's take a look at how the translation productivity tool like Studio works. So it is at the very high level. It can be kind of described through these 4 sections that we see here on screen. So first of all, it's quite key that the text is translated into units of text, which we call segments. Typically, these are sentences, but can also be in a FrameMaker document, can be an index term, can be a heading, can be a table cell, can be all kinds of things. That's why we don't say sentence, because this would be not specific enough. So that's why we call this segment. But we basically chunk it up because this makes the content reusable. So if you drill down to the segment level, then you can make sure that you can reuse the translations as much as possible. And this is actually what we then call translation unit. So when you have a source segment that you translate as a target segment, so when you translate an English segment into German, let's say, for example, then what you create there is a translation unit, or TU. And this translation unit is like a database record which goes into the translation memory. So it's all about reuse. It's all about making sure that you never translate the same sentence twice. And this is obviously very interesting in the DITA context, for example, right? You want to have as much reusable content as possible in the source language, and this is what DITA looks after. But then in translation, you will really want to make sure that you reuse the translations in the same efficiency that you have in the source language, and this is where the translation memory really comes in. So this is where you then make sure that everything is reusable, both at an exact kind of level, so if the same sentence comes up again, it's reused as is, or when it comes to just a kind of only fuzzy, as we call it. So if the new text resembles the previous text, then we can also reuse the translation memory, and I will talk about that also in a minute. And then, as I mentioned before, terminology management is key. So what happens as we go through a document is that we also always look things up in a terminology database to make sure that we have consistent translation. Sometimes such terminology databases are also referred to as glossaries. So the glossary is kind of a simple form of a terminology database, but we like to talk about term bases more because they can be so much richer than just the source and the target term. And so that's why if you really want to do knowledge management and multilingual knowledge management, then you're looking at the terminology database. And this is where we really excel as well, in addition to our kind of main studio translation memory platform. So if we take a look at the different technology components and their benefits, definitely a translation memory is a very critical asset for any business to make sure that the entire supply chain is as productive as possible by never translating the same sentence twice and by being able to complete work faster. So it's always the same kind of discussion or consideration. You have the work giver on the one hand who wants to always look after cost and make sure that there are cost savings. But then also on the work giver side, you want to make sure that people are just more productive so that they can actually translate more volume, resulting in the cost savings for the work giver, but also resulting in healthy margin and healthy living for the work doer. So that's a very important balance that we want to strike by providing this kind of technology. If we take a look at terminology management, then I mentioned it already, this really makes sure that you use always the correct terms, that you avoid using kind of forbidden terms. So very often in the terminology lifecycle, you might see that a term that was used before is now forbidden. I think Microsoft is a good example. I think like 5-10 years ago, you would have referred to an application running on the Windows desktop, and that was the correct term back then. But now everybody has changed and uses app as the term. So in this example, then app would become the new correct term, and application would become a kind of a deprecated or incorrect term. And you can capture all this in multi-term. So you can basically say, hey, this is the term you now need to use, but be aware it used to be translated as this, and this is the reason why it's no longer translated like this. So really you can make sure that the translator and also the authoring side have all the information at hand to be able to do the right thing in terms of high quality and consistency. Then very, very key, a dedicated translation environment. So the Microsoft Office for translators again, so SDL Studio maximizes efficiency by focusing the user on real translation tasks with all kinds of bells and whistles. And also even the formatting is represented in a quite nice way so that the user knows both implicitly and explicitly what they are doing. So they know exactly in which position in the document they are. They know if something is a heading or a bullet point or a table cell, so that they can make sure that they kind of adapt the translation to the different document contexts as well. So this is all very key, and we have refined this environment over the years. And then what is also very, very key is that we have an extendable platform. So I'd like to refer to Studio not just as a productivity tool, but also as a platform for third parties to plug in. And some of these third parties are obviously machine translation providers, but others are content connectors. So if you want to connect to a content source and want to automate the project preparation, for example, then you can also plug in an app which does just that. So focuses on the pre-processing steps. Then similarly for post-processing steps, for helping the translator during translation. So by looking things up in web sites like Lingui, for example, this can all be integrated with Studio thanks to this very extendable and extensible platform. So if we take a look then concretely at Studio here, this is a screenshot, but later we will see the live demo. We basically see a translation memory here. You can see a source English sentence. You can see a target French sentence in this particular example. So a translator at some point has translated this source segment to this particular French target segment. And you can see basically then a translation unit here, which I mentioned before as well. So again, this is stored permanently, and you can then make sure that this can be reused in all kinds of future similar projects. So that's the, in a nutshell, translation memory that stores your translations as you work. It's basically like a memory for the translator. That's why it's called translation memory. So how does it work in a little bit more detail? So again, the source and target are stored in the TM as a TU. And then when the source sentence reoccurs in a document, the TM remembers exactly what the translation was, obviously, and can insert it into the document as a translation. And then the translator can see, okay, is this exactly the same text? Is it only a similar text? Do I need to edit it in any shape or form? Am I working in a team and I'm maybe not so happy with the translation another translator has provided? And so on and so forth. So all these kinds of scenarios are nicely captured in the Studio editor. So when we then take a look at the matches, which I mentioned before as well, but this is really a nice overview slide that shows in a way how rich the technology has become over the years. So we start with the highest quality match, which is basically a perfect match, which comes from a previous approved translation. So when a translation project has been reviewed once, if you have an update to that same translation project, why would you need to review or re-review the translations if it has been previously reviewed? So we want to cut down the cost on the review as well by providing this technology. And then if you do need to change, obviously you have the flexibility to do so. So that's the best one. But the second best is context match, which is basically a match from the translation memory rather than a previous approved translation. But it is identical and it is in the same context as before. So the user sees right away psychologically as well, hey, this is a very good match. I can briefly check it, or I just say, well, this will be correct, and I continue. The next best match is still a very good match and an exact match. We call it 100% match. It is, again, identical to the new content, but not necessarily anymore in context. So it means that sometimes, especially with short text and short strings, you need to be very careful not to reuse 100% matches in each and every context. So it's quite key then to be able to have the flexibility not to do that. And then if we take a look further down, we have the repetition, which is basically a sentence that has not been translated before, but it's repeated inside the current project. So again, we can realize efficiencies by maybe pre-processing such repetitions so that we make sure they are translated consistently, for example. And then finally, you have a fuzzy match where the new text is similar but not identical to the previous translation. So sometimes it might even be a negation, so a no is somewhere in the sentence, and so you need to reflect that obviously in the target language while also negating the target. So that is also very interesting technology. Actually, it's quite interesting. People in the machine translation space now talk about neural MT being all the rage in terms of machine translation, but we in translation memory are actually using or have been using neural networks since the 90s to make sure that we can search vast amounts of data fast to present the fuzzy match. The worst thing that can happen to a translator is sitting in front of the screen and waiting for a few seconds for something to appear. So that's why we want to make sure with the fuzzy match technology that it's as fast as possible. And then what is left to translate from scratch, for example, using machine translation or other aids, is new translations. So when we look a little bit deeper then at the translation memory features, we have the total leverage that we can basically get from the stored translations. We have something like concordance searching, for example, which allows the user to just search a particular word. In our 2017 release, we will have a very interesting new technology that complements concordance searching, which basically does the active search without the user actually having to do anything manually, and also presents the potential target translation for a concordance match. So that is a very interesting new technology that we are currently releasing to the market, and it's people are very excited in the supply chain about this. Then I mentioned them before. The context matches are key because it takes the overall location in the document into consideration. And then a question that we get very often is, what do I do if I have got existing material where I've got source and target English and German or French or Japanese, Chinese, Arabic? I have this already in electronic form, so I might have a set of FrameMaker documents that were translated before, but I don't have a translation memory yet. Then alignment is your friend because you can use these existing translations in electronic form and through alignment bring them into translation memories. So that is interesting at the segment level. And then when it comes to terminology, we also have term extraction, which basically does the same thing, but at the terminology level and not the entire segment level. So the value of a translation memory in a nutshell is kind of obvious if you think about that you never translate the same segment twice and that you never translate the same fuzzy match also twice, but rather you can post-edit faster. But to really show the benefits, what is very key is that the work giver side, I mentioned them before, the corporates, the LSPs, they need to have a way of calculating actually what a translation project will actually cost. And in order to do that, we have the so-called document analysis, which is shown here in a nutshell, where basically you have new content that needs to be translated, but then lots of fuzzy matches that are in the document, which you can use repetitions as well. So you know already, even without having a full translation memory available, you know that 68 of the words are repeated. For example, when you go from a C6330 to a 6440 for a Dell Latitude in the owner's menu, right? So this is exactly where translation memory shines. I used the other example before, Windows, let's say 8.1 going to Windows 10, or Windows 10 first edition going to Windows 10 second edition. Then basically what you have is you can reuse so much, and this is where the TM is, really shines, because it just makes sure that everything can be reused as much as possible. At the same time, you also have the term base, obviously. But if we just in a nutshell can summarize this, the translation memory is made up of entire sentences, and term bases consist of the terms. So we have a good example here on the right-hand side. I will also show a few examples during our demo later. But basically, terms are individual, very specific words, are also multi-word items. You can see a few here, like matrix precision pixel printer, quite a long term, but these can also work. For the government, we have long treaty names that are in the term base, for example, so that can be anything. There, of course, can be brand names, so you can speak with one voice also in terms of the brand. There's new things invented all the time, so how do you refer to it? How do you standardize the terminology around it? That's exactly what multi-term is here for as well. You can store acronyms as synonyms. You can really be as flexible as you want to be. And this then means that you can be consistent in the entire process, from authoring, from content management, to translation. So really all these aspects are key when we talk about terminology. That's why it's key to consider terminology not just as a translation productivity piece, but rather in its own right. And that's why we also have a dedicated solution for it, rather than just it being a glossary component in the CAT tool itself. So what are the reasons to choose SDL? Well, I mentioned one key one is just the market leader. So if you are looking for resources to do work for you, then you will find them most easily in the SDL community. We also, over the years, have built up a rich portfolio of free learning resources with lots and lots of webinars, tutorials, and the community that we have with already hundreds of users in there as well, maybe even thousands now. So we have a place where people can meet, where can they ask questions, because such an environment can be quite complex and flexible to use. And so it's often important to be able to ask questions and get answers. So that's what the community is there for. We have very regular roadshows that we do. Actually, this autumn and this fall, we are doing a very extensive roadshow. We are also at TechComm next week, obviously. Well, we are here in the DITA world, so thanks again for the opportunity also to Adobe for being able to do that. We are at industry conferences. I was at a machine translation conference last weekend. So we are really very active in the world just to make sure that we spread the message around Trados and Studio. We have an app store, and that is definitely one of the key reasons to choose us, because we are the only ones out there that have that. So basically, you can come to us and extend the solution by having access to more than 200 apps. So we have a very rich portfolio of additional helpers for users. And these are really apps, lightweight plugins to our platform so that you can work more efficiently. Obviously, our global presence, I talked about that already. And then the partnerships, both at the technology level, so Adobe comes to mind, but also when it comes to working with language service providers and universities. So we have partner programs for this as well. So these are kind of non-software related benefits that you get when you choose us. But now finally, what about the support for Adobe DITA content authored in Adobe FrameMaker? How does it work? So this is just a screenshot, but we will dig a lot deeper now. But just to show you what is so key and what differentiates us so much from all the other guys out there is our extremely rich support and lots of options around file type management. So here you just see one page for file type configuration for the MIF file type in FrameMaker. Obviously that's not DITA, but the native MIF format. But we support even that in like lots and lots of detail. So you can really drill down to a very low level of content processing that makes sure that you can work in the most efficient way possible and in the most sophisticated way possible as well, because that's very often needed. What do you do with references? How do you deal with hidden text? How do you deal with master pages, and so on and so forth? So this is all in here and a very rich, deep support. And then when it comes to DITA, since this is an XML file format, we can use our generic XML support that we have, but then customize it for the specialties of DITA. And here you can see just one example that I will also show. How do I preview a DITA file? Well, I know enough about DITA because it's standardized to be able to preview it with the style sheet that we ship. It's then not the same look and feel as in FrameMaker, for example, because there is lots more in FrameMaker for the authoring process, but it's definitely good enough for me to get a very good idea as a translator what the file will look like in the ultimate rendering. And obviously, since it's XML, it can be rendered in any shape or form anyway. So it's not kind of limited to the way FrameMaker works with it. So let's then at the end now do a demo. I think have like 10 minutes or so, which hopefully should be enough to take a look. So I'm continuing to share my screen. I'm just checking. Yeah, you should see my screen. So here I'm in Adobe FrameMaker, XML author, so the DITA way of working with FrameMaker. And Stefan kindly provided me with an example that I've quite liked, that is just very good to show. So it's a kind of a set of or sample project for DITA for FrameMaker. So if I open the kind of DITA map, just with all the files, and then this is what I get here. Actually, let me check again which, if I open the right one, because I made that mistake before I'm preparing. Yeah, so I'm here in the source language where I'm opening this. You can see the folder and file structure in this DITA map. And if I go to just one file, and that's the one that we will look at, this is the file that I have maybe in English. So how do I translate the entire project with Studio, but also how do I then work with specific files? That's the topic of the demo. So we can see here a nicely formatted DITA file in FrameMaker with bullet points, with footnotes, with a graphic and so on. So quite some usual kind of elements you would expect in a rich document. And so if I now switch over to Studio, I will just close the files here, just so that we take the next step. So if I switch over here to Studio, this is the SDL Studio environment, the latest version, actually not yet released. You are a very privileged audience today because I'm just using the latest 2017 almost release candidates. So we are at the very last phases of the release, but I thought I'd show you the most recent version and not go back to the 2015 version or previous versions. So you have a very kind of user-friendly user interface where you can drag files for translation and so on. But obviously, preparing for the demo, I have already prepared the project. So if you take a look here on the left-hand side, basically this gives you an overview of your project and it drills down various levels. So you have the project level, then you have the individual files level, then you have reporting around what I mentioned before, document analysis, for example, that shows you the leverage from your translation memory or termbase and so on. Then we have the editor where the actual translation happens, and then you've got kind of management user interface for translation memories, and then in multi-term you would have the same for term bases. So you can see a long list of projects. I'm playing around with the tool a lot, but obviously today we want to focus on the DITA World demo. And it's kind of interesting. If you take a look at this way of representing the DITA project, and if we go back briefly to here, you can see the similarities, right? So you can see folders and file names. Here also you can see folders and file names. In this case, it's expanded. In this case, it's just a flat folder structure. But you can see here the documents that can be translated. And you can also see that I prepared this a little bit for today, but it shows you in a nutshell, again, what I showed you in theory before. So if I want to translate a document, I would like to translate the document that I obviously showed you before, the launch and landing site one. So I can just click on this file name and then open it here in the editor. And this is really the key piece where users work and translators work. But I would like to point out also specific elements that are relevant for better translation processes. For example, here on the right-hand side, if I click on this, you can see the document structure information, very key. So I know now as a translator, well, I'm translating a title here, so I better make sure that the phrasing in the target language represents a title. If I go next to this one here, it is a short description. So it is kind of the intro sentence that we had in the FrameMaker document. Then actually what we don't see in the FrameMaker document, we see here as well, meaning key things like the index terms. So we have some index entries which we need to translate, and we can see that those are index terms. So what I want to say with this is basically that also here you have a kind of a document explorer that shows you where you are. So it's very key for a professional translation to know where you are in a document so that you don't make translation mistakes because you translate text only, for example. So we have been working with our user base over the years to make sure that we have the most powerful environment here that allows me to work most efficiently. But I should also mention, if I go back to the first segment here, that we also have terminology integrated. So if I just briefly look at this. So the term launch and landing site has been added to multi-term before. It is now recognized during translation. So if I go here and view the term details, I actually even can put graphics in with the same graphic that we saw in the FrameMaker document. So to allow maximum consistency, so the user right away sees, well, this is the same graphic as I have just seen in the FrameMaker document, for example. So I can then make sure, or I am sure that this is the proper translation for it. I've provided just for fun the context, but I mentioned that lots and lots of other details can be put into terminology to make it very rich and very sophisticated. Then up here, we see the actual heart of the system, the translation memory. And I mentioned that I translated this document before, just so that I don't spend the time in the demo translating. But what is key is you can see also here, you can see things like AT and so on. So I started with a machine translation, which we call automated translation. And then as I went through the document, my translations got stored in the translation memory and are now context matches. So this is what I mentioned before as well. So within the same context, I have already translated this before. So we can just browse through a few segments here to show you how it all works. The translation memory can be local on my disk. It can sit on a remote server. It can even sit in the cloud very soon. So we are building a cloud-based translation memory sharing as well, so that users can really work the way they want. That's also a key thing in our technology, and a key wish that I always have as a product manager. Translation is very complex and can be very daunting in terms of all the tools that you have and all the different challenges that you might have. And for me as a product manager for this tool, it's very key to have the utmost flexibility, and that the user can really look left and right and be as flexible as possible, so that they can be more productive and are not frustrated by being shoehorned into working a certain way. So I think this is a very key differentiator also for us. Anyway, if we take a look at some of the other highlights here, so you saw the bold up here, which also highlights the heading and title. Down here, I've got an interesting one where there's a footnote in the DITA structure, and so this is how we handle the footnotes. I've got some italics down here, so we try to show the formatting as is as well. But obviously, nothing beats a quick preview, right? So even if I don't have FrameMaker, I might want to take a look at how the document roughly will look like. And for that, we have the preview here. So this is a very powerful environment where you can basically say, hey, show me the initial preview. And then I get a kind of lightweight, same way of document as I just saw in FrameMaker, but obviously now rendered using HTML in a browser kind of window here. But what is quite nice is the footnote is here, and if I go down, then I see the footnote down here. I've got, again, the same graphic shown. So it definitely gives me a feeling of consistency that I'm doing the right thing in terms of translating this particular FrameMaker DITA document, even if then at the end it's formatted slightly differently in FrameMaker itself. So what I can do, and this is also very nice, I can navigate. So I can basically click on a segment and then it jumps to the corresponding segment or sentence in the document itself in the translation editor, so that I can then basically go in here and maybe say, well, I need to change this translation and do something here, which I would post edit. So that is basically in a nutshell how this piece works, the translation side. Now, how do I get the file back into FrameMaker, and how do I make sure that in FrameMaker I'm still getting a valid XML file, for example? Well, we've got very rich QA checks. So if I just take a brief look at the project settings, we have verification, which we call here. So we have an QA checker, which basically checks all kinds of inconsistencies. It can even use regular expressions. It's very rich. We've got a tag verification, meaning if I don't have the proper footnote tag, this would be handled. But then also very key as part of the very rich file type support, if I take a look at the OASIS DITA settings here, we also have validation here. So we can perform schema and DTD validation when opening the file, when writing the file, to make absolutely sure it's valid against the DTDs. And actually here you can see the nice kind of DITA DTDs being shown. And these are also used for the preview, by the way. But now, how do I get back to the FrameMaker side of things? One way is a batch task here, which basically can export the file. And why don't I use that? I can basically say, okay, export the file, please export the target version, put it into a particular folder, which I already preset before. And I'll say finish. I now just exported this one file, but obviously you could export the entire project. And I will reopen the file here as well, but just to then show the result in FrameMaker. So let me close this data map then. And let me open the German one, which is here under target files, DEDE. So that's clear that this is a German. And if I then have all files here and take a look at the corresponding file in German, you nicely see my translation now in German, no longer in English, exactly the same formatting, exactly the same footnotes, exactly the same everything. So this is obviously then a very nice way of then doing the final check. Obviously, you could do some DTP work here if required, but in this particular case, it just went through very smoothly. So that's in a nutshell how that side would work. So we've seen the entire round trip, and I'm anyway coming up to the end of the presentation. But one thing that I did want to show is translation memory reuse. So if I go here, you will see actually, hey, what has happened in this other file down here? I've just translated this one file. I just didn't touch the rest. But what has happened here in this file? It's a data map file. And actually, you can nicely see the reuse because the document that I just translated was launch and landing site. And I've got the 100% match here in this particular document because, well, it's already been translated before. So that is really in a nutshell also how the reuse at the translation memory level works. So I just wanted to make sure that you have seen that as well. And again, you also have the information around the data map support in here as well. So that's basically in a nutshell how the round trip would work. And with this, I will stop sharing and we can go for questions and answers, I guess. But thanks very much so far.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So let me check the chat so we have a look at it together. So there was one question from Kelly. She's asking who owns the translation memory, SDL or the company that requested the translation?
The company that requested the translation typically owns it. So that is actually a very interesting question, and I could have a very long answer here, but I want to keep it short. So the ideal scenario is that the work giver, the corporate, not SDL, definitely not, but the work giver owns this. But some work givers don't know this, and so they don't know how to handle this, because they don't appreciate translation in the same way as others might do. So very often companies outsource everything to the LSP. And then in that case, the LSP might actually own the translation memory and work with it, which is fine. But I think that the kind of typical or best practice scenarios that the corporate should own the content so that they are flexible in terms of also the translation supply chain they use.
There's one interesting question from Kelly again. Our company has contracted 2 translation companies. We are struggling with building the translation memories for both vendors. That sounds very much like a TM server solution for me. Right, Daniel?
Your voice comes across a little bit distorted, but I think, so basically, it's a very good question if I understand it correctly. So you've got 2 vendors, and they each have their own TM, and how do you consolidate that? I think that is, once again, if you centralize this on your end rather than trusting the vendors with this, then you have the advantage that you control the TM on your end, and the supply chain, including the vendors, use that on your end. But obviously, there's various ways of working. It's just the best in terms of having the best control over everything. I've got some questions here, Stefan, which I see, which are also very interesting in terms of the data map support, because I was wondering about that as well. So in preparing this demo today, I looked at our data support and I actually found that data map wasn't supported out of the box. So I quickly went in and I changed the data file type to support it. It was very easy actually. So we really have homework here to make it easier for our users as well out of the box. But what we cannot do, and this is a very good question, is can the translator follow the same structure? I think in our example, the structure is kind of implicit in the folders and file structure. And so you could work that way then that you work roughly the same. But I think at some point it would be very interesting to have a very intelligent data map support, which pulls in the files in the correct order, and you then translate in the correct order dictated by the data map structure. but we are not there yet. So it's a very good enhancement that we can look at in future.
I think Ray commented on that as well. So you load the DITA map in the Studio project, and all the files are pulled in. That's definitely definitely a nice thing. That Studio can read the DITA map and understand which files are in the referenced in the DITA map, and then pulls the whole file in.
Could actually be an interesting app actually that someone might look at even in our app store. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, definitely.
But if the author is not using FrameMaker, it's not possible. It doesn't really matter which tool you are using there, Mindy. So you can use Oxygen. You can use, that's the power of a standard like DITA. You can use more or less every XML editor that is capable of understanding DITA and handling DITA. So that's the good thing about DITA, that you can use all these XML editors. And FrameMaker is, of course, the best editor for editing DITA content, of course. But basically, you can exchange the files easily. And even a tool like, even a translation tool like Trados can understand DITA then, and you can easily exchange the files between these tools, between FrameMaker and Trados, and both use the same DITA file, maybe converting it to XLIF or something in the Studio, but basically it's understandable by a lot of tools. Okay, it seems we don't have any more questions, Daniel. Thank you very much. Thanks for everyone who's in the room and was attending this awesome presentation from Daniel. Thanks, Daniel, for making this presentation today and for being flexible. And with this, I would like to stop the recording.
Thank you.
Because we have only 8 minutes left before the next presenter comes in. And this will be Janine Trachtenberg from Across, and she will show us how that whole thing works in Across. So thanks again, and goodbye.